Fred and his family had always loved their home. It was a modest, middle-class house with a backyard that was perfect for their two children, Danny and Emma, to play in. The trampoline they had set up was their favorite spot, and their laughter often filled the air, a melody that brought joy to Fred and his wife, Laura. But for their neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, it was nothing short of unbearable. Living next to Mrs. Whitaker was like living beside a ticking time bomb. She was perpetually grumpy, always ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Over the years, she had developed a habit of finding fault with the most innocent activities. Her favorite pastime, it seemed, was calling the police on Fred's family. And last week, it happened again. Fred was fixing a loose board on the deck when he heard a knock at the door. He sighed, already knowing who was behind it. Sure enough, Officer Roberts stood there, his face a mixture of apology and resignation. "Hi, Fred," the officer said, tipping his hat. "We've had another call about screaming children. Mind if I take a look?" Fred laughed humorlessly. "Sure, come in. The kids are just playing as usual." Officer Roberts walked to the backyard where Danny and Emma were jumping on the trampoline, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. The officer shook his head and turned to Fred. "Fred, I'm so sorry about all this," he said. "Obviously, there's nothing wrong here. Kids will be kids, won't they?" "Exactly," Fred replied, frustration creeping into his voice. "But try telling that to Mrs. Whitaker." After the officer left, Fred sat on the porch, stewing in anger. Laura joined him, sensing his agitation. "What did Officer Roberts say this time?" she asked. "Same old," Fred replied. "He apologized, admitted it was petty, and left. But we can't keep living like this. We have to do something." Laura nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "Let's figure something out. I'm tired of walking on eggshells in our own home." That evening they sat at the kitchen table, brainstorming solutions. Mediation, filing a complaint, nothing seemed right. Finally, Fred decided to confront Mrs. Whitaker directly. It was time to get to the bottom of this. The next day, Fred walked to her house, his mind racing. He knocked on the door, and when it opened, there she was, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of him. "Mrs. Whitaker," Fred began, keeping his tone calm, "we need to talk. Why do you keep calling the police on us?" Her response was instant and venomous. "Your children are loud and wild, like a pack of animals," she spat. "You need to control them better. And you," she jabbed a bony finger at him, "are a terrible father. They need a good old-fashioned beating to learn some respect." Fred stood there, stunned. Her words hit him like a punch in the gut, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger, "they're just children. They're playing. They're happy. They have every right to enjoy their childhood." "Not at my expense," she snapped. "If you don't do anything, I will." Fred walked home, his jaw clenched. When he told Laura what had happened, her face turned pale, then flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable," she said. "We can't let her keep doing this to us." "Exactly," Fred replied. "We need to take action, something that shows her we won't be intimidated anymore." Together, they came up with a plan. First, they installed a security camera with a bright nightlight, facing Mrs. Whitaker's property. Then, they decided to throw a party, a big, loud, joyful party for their kids and their friends. They called it the Nosy Extravaganza. By the end of the week, over 20 children had RSVP'd. The trampoline was ready, a water slide was rented, and the backyard was stocked with snacks and drinks. Danny and Emma were thrilled. On Sunday, the party began. The backyard was a paradise of laughter and fun. Fred and Laura sat on the porch, sipping cold drinks and watching the chaos with satisfaction. From time to time, Fred caught a glimpse of Mrs. Whitaker peeking through her curtains, her face twisted in annoyance. At one point, Fred raised his glass in a mocking toast, smirking as she disappeared from the window in a huff. Laura laughed. "I think we made ourselves understood." "I think so too," Fred replied, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. In the days that followed, the neighborhood was quiet. The security camera and bright light acted as a perfect deterrent, and Mrs. Whitaker stopped causing trouble. Danny and Emma continued to play happily in the backyard, their laughter no longer clouded by fear. One evening, as Fred and Laura sat on the porch, Laura hugged him and smiled. "You know," she said, "sometimes the best way to solve a problem is with a little ingenuity and a lot of laughter." Fred nodded, peace settling around them. "You're right, and I think we've finally found our peace." And with that, their family reclaimed their home, their happiness, and their sanity. All it took was a camera, a light, and a party to remind them that their joy was worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share to support my channel.